Usually when you open up a vintage pocket watch, there's this expectation of just perfect, isolated mechanics. You see the brass gears, one spins, it catches the teeth of the next, and it just turns.
Right, it's totally predictable.
Exactly, it's comforting. We like our complex systems to be visible, to be neatly categorized and behave exactly as we engineer them.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole appeal of a closed system. You can easily diagnose a problem because, well, every piece has one specific isolated job.
But then imagine just one of those tiny internal gears gets, I don't know, a fraction of a degree warmer. The metal expands.
Oh, right.
And suddenly it's rubbing against a delicate spring, which throws off a lever, and the entire timekeeping mechanism just starts behaving erratically.
And you can't just fix that single gear anymore.
No, you're forced to look at how every single piece of that watch is intimately connected. And stepping into the science of climate change is, well, it's exactly like looking at that expanding gear.
Yeah.
The diagnostic landscape is incredibly murky, highly volatile, and just deeply interconnected.
It is the absolute definition of a complex cascading system. You cannot pull on one single thread, whether that's, ocean temperatures or agricultural policy, without unraveling something completely unexpected on the literal opposite side of the planet.
Welcome to today's custom-tailored deep dive. For you listening right now, we are embarking on a really massive mission today. We are unpacking a comprehensive 2022 review article by Abbas and a whole team of researchers.
It's a huge undertaking.
It really is.
Yeah.
This work synthesizes the global impacts of climate change, the adaptation strategies we desperately need, and the sustainable mitigation measures we just have to take. It is a monumental gathering of data.
Basically a panoramic view of a planetary crisis.
Yeah, and I know what you might be thinking right now. Climate change can often feel like this massive, abstract data cloud. It's statistics about polar bears, melting ice caps, ozone layers.
Things that feel very far away.
Right. But today, we're going to break down exactly how this expanding gear connects to your daily life. We're talking about everything from the price of your morning coffee to the hidden microscopic mechanics operating right now inside your local wastewater treatment plant.
But to really understand those daily localized impacts, we first have to set the global baseline.
Okay, where do we start?
Well, the overarching goal for the planet right now was set by the 2015 Paris Agreement. The objective is to keep the global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels.
Right, and ideally limit that increase to 1.5 degrees.
Exactly.
Which, to the average person checking their weather app, that sounds like such a tiny number. Like a 1.5 degree difference on a Tuesday afternoon is completely imperceptible to a human being.
On a Tuesday, sure, yes.
Yeah.
But in planetary climatological terms, it's an enormous amount of trapped thermal energy. And the timeline for hitting that threshold is aggressively accelerating compared to historical natural emissions.
Because of us, basically.
Yeah, the primary drivers pushing this acceleration are anthropogenic, meaning human-caused activities. We are looking at the massive burning of fossil fuels, widespread global deforestation, and, the heavy continuous mechanization of our agricultural systems.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because going from a high-level global policy agreement in Paris to the actual physical shocks happening on the ground is quite a leap.
It is.
We had this baseline temperature goal, but what we are actually experiencing day to day are these sudden, violent natural disasters.
Yeah, we are seeing the transition from the abstract data to immediate physical reality. Globally, natural disasters claim an average of 60,000 lives every single year.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, that is about 0.1% of all global deaths.
That is just a staggering human toll.
It really is. And we have to make a really critical distinction in that data. We have always had low-frequency, high-impact shocks, things like the devastating 1983 to 1985 Ethiopian famine, or the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, or the 2010 earthquake in Haiti.
Right. Earthquakes and tsunamis are geological events. They're driven by tectonic plates, not by carbon emissions in the atmosphere.
Exactly, and we cannot prevent those geological events. But what we are measuring now is a steady, alarming rise in climate-driven anomalies.
The weather extremes.
Right. Between 1978 and 2018, so just over a 40-year window, there was a 257% relative increase in extreme temperature events globally.
257% in just 4 decades. That's insane.
And the derivative effects are even more extreme.
Right.
Over that exact same period, there was a 12,250% relative increase in wildfire events.
12,000%. I mean, that is a number that almost loses its meaning because it's so large.
That's hard to process.
Yeah, I used to think of this like playing Russian roulette with the climate, but that doesn't really capture the physics of it. It's more like rolling a loaded die. And the weighted lead inside the die is actively melting and shifting with every single roll. The mechanics of the game are changing, making the absolute worst possible outcomes more and more statistically guaranteed.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, these disasters are not just isolated human tragedies, as horrific as they are. They are causing massive global economic losses that ripple through our deeply interconnected supply chains.
Right.
Take China in January of 2016 as a prime example. In just that single month, they experienced an economic loss of 298.3 billion yuan directly due to natural disasters.
And a loss like that doesn't just stay within China's borders. When a massive industrial zone floods, microchips don't get loaded onto cargo ships.
Exactly.
That means a few weeks later, a car manufacturing plant in Germany is forced to halt production, which ultimately drives up the price of a vehicle for someone trying to buy a car in Chicago. The financial ripples are completely global.
And it demands this relentless, exhausting cycle of rebuilding. You are pouring billions of dollars into reconstructing critical infrastructure that, well, it might just be destroyed again the following year rather than investing that capital into future innovation.
That relentless cycle of economic shock brings us directly to what is arguably our most vulnerable global sector, which is our food supply. And there's a massive paradox here.
The agriculture paradox, yeah.
We just talked about how agriculture, with its heavy machinery and fertilizers, is responsible for 30 to up to 40% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. It's driving the warming, but it's also the very first sector to get crushed by it.
Yeah.
It is literally a snake eating its own tail.
That is the harsh reality of the agricultural feedback loop. We are heavily reliant on systems that are actively undermining their own future viability.
Right.
Wheat yields globally are dropping rapidly due to rising average temperatures. In China, researchers measured a 4.6% reduction in rice production for every 1 degree Celsius increase in nighttime temperatures.
Okay, wait, I really want to dig into that mechanism.
Yeah.
Why nighttime temperatures specifically? You'd think the scorching midday heat would be the main culprit for killing a crop.
It actually comes down to basic plant biology and thermodynamics. Plants need a period of rest. During the day, they undergo photosynthesis, building up energy. At night, they respire.
Okay.
If the ambient temperature doesn't drop after the sun goes down, the plant's respiration rate remains incredibly high.
So it's essentially running a marathon in its sleep. It burns through all the cellular energy it just accumulated during the day rather than using that energy to actually grow and produce grain.
Precisely. It exhausts itself just trying to maintain baseline survival. And we see similar catastrophic mechanical biological failures in maize or corn.
What happens with maize?
Maize experiences severe heat stress when ambient temperatures rise above 35 degrees Celsius, particularly if this happens during its flowering or silking stage.
Ah, and that silking stage is the absolute most critical window for pollination.
Yes. And when it gets that hot, the biological mechanics of pollination literally break down. The pollen becomes unviable. So the plant itself might survive the heat wave. It might look perfectly green and healthy from the highway, but the actual yield, the kernels of corn we rely on for food and livestock feed, is completely decimated.
And it's not just our engineered crops that are struggling to survive these subtle temperature shifts. When we look at global biodiversity, it boils down to a brutal evolutionary reality for plants and animals. Right? You either adapt, you move, or you die.
That's the stark reality. We are tracking geographic range shifts across thousands of species. The American pika, which is a small mountain-dwelling mammal, is a perfect, observable example.
We need the told, right?
Exactly. To survive, they require cool alpine climates. As their habitats warm, they are shifting farther and further up the mountains, moving north to find cooler air.
But, I mean, eventually you run out of mountain.
And that is resulting in localized extirpation, meaning the species goes locally extinct in that specific area because their thermal runway literally ended.
They just get pushed right off the map. And the exact same ecosystem restructuring is happening underwater, too. The shift from kelp forests to seaweed turfs is just mind-blowing.
It is a dramatic visual representation of a warming ocean. These massive, towering kelp forests, which act as the foundational architecture for entire marine ecosystems, are dying off as the water temperatures rise.
And what takes their place?
They're being replaced by low-lying seaweed turfs.
Which completely changes the real estate of the ocean floor. The local cold water fish that relied on the kelp for shelter and hunting, they leave.
Right.
And suddenly, these former kelp forests are being overrun by tropical fish that have migrated miles away from the equator into the now warmer waters.
Yeah.
The entire demographic of the neighborhood gets replaced in just a few seasons.
And that completely disrupts the local fishing economies that have relied on those specific cold water species for generations. But, as we look at how plants and animals are shifting their geographic ranges, we have to recognize that macroscopic life, the fish, the pikas, the trees, they aren't the only things on the move.
Right. If the temperature changes where a deer or a fish can comfortably live, it inevitably changes where microscopic threats can thrive. This brings us to the human health impacts, and I gotta say, this part of the deep dive is where the invisible mechanics of climate change become legitimately terrifying.
Yeah, the data here is sobering. The World Health Organization projects that between 2030 and 2050, climate-induced health crises will cause an additional 250,000 deaths per year.
250,000 extra human lives lost annually, just from the shifting climate's effect on disease.
A major factor driving that mortality rate is the geographic expansion of vectors. As global temperatures warm, the habitable footprints of disease-carrying insects expand outward from the equator.
Like mosquitoes.
Exactly. Mosquitoes carrying malaria and dengue fever, sandflies and ticks carrying Lyme disease. These vectors can now survive, breed, and overwinter in higher latitudes and higher altitudes that were historically far too cold to support them.
But the threat goes even deeper than insects. Here's where it gets really interesting. The data clearly links climate change directly to antimicrobial resistance, or AMR.
This is a critical biological connection that most people, and honestly even many policymakers, completely miss. Warmer southern climates already demonstrate a demonstrably higher abundance of antibiotic-resistant bacterial strains.
Because of the heat.
Yes, the fundamental rule of microbiology is that the warmer the environment, the more rapidly bacteria can multiply, mutate, and evolve.
And we've created these highly concentrated, perfect incubation chambers for this evolution, haven't we? Urban wastewater treatment plants. I was looking at the mechanics of this, and these plants act like a microscopic genetic swap meet where bacteria are actively trading super armor with each other.
That is an incredibly accurate way to visualize it. Inside a modern wastewater treatment plant, you have an incredibly dense, concentrated mix of various bacteria from a city's population.
Mixed with all sorts of other stuff.
Crucially, yes, you also have trace amounts of antibiotics that are excreted in human waste. This creates the perfect stress environment for what biologists call horizontal gene transfer.
Meaning they aren't just passing these resistant traits down vertically to their offspring over generations. They are handing them sideways to completely different species of bacteria sitting right next to them in the water.
Exactly. The bacteria are actively sharing survival tools. And there are three primary mechanisms for this transfer. The first is transformation, where a bacterium simply absorbs free-floating genetic material from its surrounding environment.
Which is basically like a soldier walking across a battlefield and picking up a piece of discarded, highly advanced armor from a fallen enemy and just putting it on.
Yes, exactly. And then you have transduction, where a bacteriophage, which is a virus that infects bacteria, acts like an unwitting courier, accidentally carrying resistant genes from one bacterial host and injecting them into another.
Wow. And the third one?
The third is conjugation, which, to put it bluntly, is just direct bacterial mating. They physically connect and share a copy of their DNA, including these antibiotic resistance genes, or ARGs.
And the truly concerning part of this localized evolution is what happens next, right? After the water is treated, which kills a lot of bacteria but doesn't necessarily destroy all the free-floating genetic material or the most hardened superbugs, this effluent water is often discharged into the environment or utilized in agricultural irrigation systems.
What's fascinating here is the sheer scale of the economic and societal threat this poses, beyond just the biology.
Because it's getting into our food.
Right. And if this warming trend accelerates bacterial evolution and pushes humanity into a true post-antibiotic era, the financial and human costs become almost incalculable.
Everything changes.
Common medical procedures that we take for granted today, routine appendix surgeries, standard chemotherapy treatments, or just treating a normal case of pneumonia, they become incredibly dangerous, potentially fatal, and vastly more expensive to manage. It creates this massive, invisible, crushing economic burden on an already strained global healthcare system.
It's terrifying specifically because it's invisible. You can board up your windows for a hurricane, but you can't see this microbial threat coming through your irrigation water. But that chronic, invisible dread leads us directly into another consequence we rarely measure or talk about. What living in this constant state of biological and environmental anxiety does to the human mind.
The psychological toll of climate change is profound and measurable. We are seeing significant increases in generalized anxiety, chronic distress, and post-traumatic stress disorder across the general public.
And that mental health crisis is being fueled by two distinct things. First, you have the direct, localized exposure to sudden disasters. Surviving a flood or a massive wildfire changes your brain chemistry. The lasting mental health impacts and community-wide trauma following events like Hurricane Katrina, they're well documented.
Absolutely.
And second, for everyone else, there's just the constant daily barrage of media reports. Waking up every day to news about melting ice caps and superbugs is a slow drip of psychological trauma.
But we also have to look closely at the communities that are most intimately connected to nature, whose entire reality is bound to the ecosystem. There are roughly 1.6 billion people worldwide who rely directly on forests for their daily livelihoods, their shelter, and their localized economies.
1.6 billion people. That is a massive portion of humanity whose daily survival is dictated by the health of the woods.
And their daily reality is being upended. Imagine your entire local economy, your family's income for generations, is based on harvesting specific tree nuts or sap. If those trees experience delayed fruiting because the winter was too warm, your income completely disappears for the year.
And it's not just the loss of income. When those people go out to work in the forests, they are facing entirely new aggressive threats.
Oh, definitely.
In the Himalayas and Bangladesh, communities living at high altitudes are suddenly dealing with swarms of tropical mosquitoes and entirely new species of aggressive wasps that have never historically existed at those elevations.
The environment they have understood for centuries is literally turning alien, and the forests themselves are under massive attack from what we call the pest outbreak phenomenon.
I've always thought of forests as these mighty, permanent fixtures of the landscape, but when you break down the mechanics of a pest outbreak, the trees are essentially sitting ducks.
It represents a fundamental mismatch in evolutionary adaptation speed. On one side of the battle, you have trees. They are increasingly weakened by more frequent, violent storms and prolonged multi-year droughts.
They're stressed.
Very stressed. When a tree is severely water-stressed, it cannot produce the natural chemical defenses, like sap, that it normally uses to push out invading insects.
It's dehydrated and its immune system is shot. And on the other side of the battle,
You have the pests. Warmer global climates provide a massive biological advantage for insects. They inherently have very short generation times, meaning they reproduce, mutate, and evolve incredibly rapidly to take advantage of new conditions.
Wow.
And, crucially, they are highly mobile.
so the trees are physically rooted to the ground, stuck dealing with whatever drought or heat wave hits them, while the insects can just, pack their bags, multiply exponentially in the warmer weather, and fly to wherever the forest is weakest. It is an incredibly unfair fight.
It is a battle of agility versus permanence, which brings us to the ultimate systemic question. Knowing all of this, how do we systematically respond?
Exactly. How do we untangle this massive web of interconnected crises? How do we protect the pocket watch? The science outlines two main pillars of human defense: mitigation and adaptation.
And it's vital to clearly distinguish between these two approaches. Mitigation is about actively reducing the magnitude of the climate change itself. It is treating the root cause of the illness.
It's stopping the bleeding at the source.
Right. This involves the massive systemic reduction of greenhouse gases. It means halting global deforestation so we retain our carbon sinks, and aggressively shifting our massive energy grids away from fossil fuels and towards solar, wind, and hydropower.
Okay, so that's mitigation. What about adaptation?
Adaptation, on the other hand, is about minimizing the harmful, localized effects of the changes that are already locked into the system and happening right now.
It's learning to live with the wound and figuring out how to function despite it.
Yes. If we look back at the agricultural sector, we see massive adaptation efforts currently underway. In frost-prone northern areas, farmers are actively extending their planting seasons to take advantage of the shorter winters.
Making the most of the warmth.
Exactly. And in equatorial regions, they are implementing split seasons for short-period crops, carefully timing their planting to entirely avoid the absolute peak lethal heat of the midsummer months.
And we are leaning heavily into agricultural biotechnology, too. We're genetically altering crop varieties, engineering maize and wheat that are specifically designed on a cellular level to be highly heat and drought resistant.
But biological adaptation is really only half the battle. Surviving this requires massive shifts in global policy and economics. There is a pressing necessity for resource-rich nations, particularly those whose entire GDP is reliant on fossil fuel exports, to aggressively diversify their economies.
Because if mitigation works, and the whole world successfully transitions to clean energy and stops buying oil, those single-resource economies will completely collapse overnight, which would trigger a whole new global economic crisis.
Precisely. They need to transition their capital immediately, dramatically increasing research and development in renewable infrastructure. And crucially, for any of this to work globally, there must be unhindered technology transfer across international borders.
We have to share the blueprints.
We must. Highly developed nations have to help subsidize and physically transfer clean energy technologies to developing nations to remove the massive cost barrier of entry. You cannot fight a global atmospheric threat with localized, hoarded technology. It requires a globally coordinated, synchronized response.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this right now? It means realizing that fixing climate change is not just a localized conservation effort. It's not just about saving the polar bears or preserving a nice view at a national park.
No, it's much bigger.
It is a fundamental, urgent requirement to upgrade the entirety of human infrastructure. We're talking about retrofitting everything from how we plant a field of corn, to how we engineer the microscopic filters in our wastewater treatment plants, to how we structure global financial and technological policies. We're frantically trying to adapt our systems to survive an entirely new physical reality.
This deep dive reinforces the undeniable reality that climate change is the master variable of the 21st century. It touches every single facet of human existence.
It is the single extending gear that alters the entire pocket watch.
And the most vital takeaway from analyzing all of this data is that critical systems-level thinking is absolutely essential. We cannot treat the agricultural sector, the global healthcare system, and our international energy grids in isolation. They are deeply, inextricably interwoven, and a shock to one is a shock to all.
We really want to thank you for going on this intense, complex journey through the science with us today. To wrap up, I want to leave you with one final philosophical thought to mull over. Think about the nature of the specific cascading threats we've explored today.
The common denominator in almost all of them is mobility.
Exactly. We talked about microscopic bacteria laterally swapping armor in moving water. We talked about tropical fish migrating miles to claim new ocean territories. We talked about insects flying rapidly to decimate weakened, rooted forests and disease vectors expanding their footprints across continents.
This raises an important question.
In a rapidly warming, highly volatile world, mobility, agility, and speed seem to completely dictate survival. So look around at our massive human systems. Look at our power grids, our agricultural supply chains, our city planning, and our rigid political borders. Are these systems agile and mobile enough to keep up with a rapidly shifting planet? Or are we acting exactly like the trees in the forest, rigidly rooted to the ground, just waiting for the weather to change?